Chapter 24. This thing, or this chapter reads it. The name of the chapter on the file I'm looking at says "My Theory" for the name of the chapter, but in the actual copy or the printing, I have it as an alternative theory as the name. I don't know why this is different. I'm not sure if I'm reading like an older file and that's why we're seeing mistakes that I thought I had fixed. So that might explain a few things, but it's not. I don't think it's so drastically different that it's affecting too much. Besides being very repetitive, which I think that's still in the actual copy as well. But just know if you're reading the actual printing, it may be slightly different versus what I've been reading here. We'll just leave it at that, but we'll continue on here. My theory begins not in the 1st century BC, but in the catastrophe that followed the Bar Kokhba revolt in AD 132 to 135. This revolt was not a minor uprising crushed at the edges of empire. It was a national trauma, the destruction of Betur, the massive loss of life, and the systematic suppression that followed reshaped Jewish existence in the ways that went far beyond military defeat. Also, I'm going to add this before we go too far. This chapter it is an alternative theory about where the scrolls came from. I don't. Since writing this book, my opinions have changed where I do think they're entirely medieval or forgeries. Where I'm making the argument that the scrolls date closer to 200 AD, which still could be right, but I've been leaning far more closer to them being medieval. But we'll continue. Under Hadrian, Judea was reorganized as Syria Palestina. Jerusalem was refounded as a Roman colony, and Jewish presence in the city was drastically restricted. The political center was gone. The temple had already been destroyed in AD 70, but the Bar Kokhba revolt extinguished any remaining realistic hope of national restoration through armed resistance. What remained was not simply exile, it was theological disorientation. For over a century, Jewish identity had revolved around covenant promises, land, temple, Messiah, restoration. The revolt had been fueled by precisely those expectations. When it failed, the crisis was not merely political, it struck at the interpretive heart of Scripture. How were the promises to be read now? Had the timetable been misunderstood? Had the Messiah been misidentified? Had divine favor been withdrawn? Communities fractured under the weight of those questions. Some Jewish some Jews responded by tightening preservation, what would later develop into Rabbinic Judaism, focused on textual stability, legal precision, and communal discipline. Scripture became increasingly guarded, interpretation was constrained within inherited boundaries. Survival depended on consolidation, but defeat does not produce any consolidation, it also produces experimentation. Displaced populations fled or were deported. Yeah. Displaced populations fled or were deported. Egypt, particularly Alexandria, offered both refuge and intellectual opportunity. There, Jewish thought had been engaged. Greek philosophy. Good grief. There, Jewish thought had long engaged Greek philosophy, allegorical interpretation, and speculative theology. In such an environment, covenant crisis did not necessarily produce stricter preservation, it could produce reinterpretation. It is in this atmosphere that I place the group reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were not Essenes frozen in time, preserving a pristine Second Temple worldview in a desert isolation, nor were they simply heirs of a sect that had somehow escaped Roman notice for 2 centuries. Rather, they were a post-Bar Kokhba Jewish movement attempting to rebuild meaning from ruin. They inherited scripture but not confidence. They inherited promises but not fulfillment. They inherited prophetic expectations but not political restoration. In such a context, the text of scripture became the text of scripture becomes more than something to guard, it becomes something to wrestle with. If covenant if covenant history had culminated in repeated devastation, Babylon, Rome in AD 70, Rome again in AD 135, then perhaps the problem lay not in God's faithfulness, but in human understanding of revelation. The solution for some would not be stricter transmission, but deeper insight. The text might need expansion, harmonization, unveiling. Hidden meanings might explain visible failure. Thus emerged a Judaism after defeat, adaptive rather than preservative, speculative rather than stabilizing, a movement shaped by trauma, convinced that ordinary interpretation had failed, and willing to experiment with Scripture itself in the search for coherence. In my view, the Dead Sea Scrolls do not reflect a confident pre Christian sect awaiting vindication. They reflect a wounded post revolt Judaism struggling to reinterpret covenant identity in a world where God's promises appeared once again to have collapsed beneath Roman boots. Displacement after the Bar Kokhba revolt did not scatter Jews aimlessly. Many followed established diasporic routes, and Egypt, especially Alexandria, was one of the most neutral destinations. Alexandria had long been one of the largest and most intellectual, vibrant Jewish centers in the Mediterranean world. It was not merely a place of safety, it was a place of ideas. Egypt functioned as a theological furnace. For centuries, Jewish thinkers in Alexandria had engaged Greek philosophical traditions. Philo of Alexandria had already demonstrated how Hebrew scriptures could be interpreted through allegory and philosophical symbolism without abandoning Jewish identity. In his writings, biblical figures embodied moral and metaphysical principles, and historical events became spiritual paradigms. Scripture was not rejected, it was reinterpreted at deeper levels. By the second century, Alexandria was even more intellectually diverse. Christian teachers were articulating fulfillment theology, logos doctrine, and new readings of Israel's scripture in light of Jesus. Gnostic movements were prospering or yeah, Gnostic movements were proposing layered cosmologies, hidden knowledge, and sharp dualisms between visible corruption and unseen truth. Interpretation was not strict, it was creative, explanatory, or exploratory, and often speculative. Into this environment came Jews shaped by the trauma of the failed revolt. The collapse of the Bar Kokhba's messianic hopes created a theological vacuum. If national restoration had failed again, then either the promises had been misunderstood or fulfillment re, had to be reconceived. Alexandria provided the tools for such reinterpretation. If visible redemption had not arrived, perhaps redemption was spiritual. If the kingdom was not political, perhaps it was cosmic. If history seemed contradictory, perhaps the true meaning of Scripture lay beneath the surface. In this setting, the post-Bar Kokhba Jewish group I am proposing appears to have absorbed several intellectual currents circulating in Egypt, elements of dualistic thinking distinguishing sharply between the corrupted present world and the hidden divine reality, a culture of secrecy where deeper truths were reserved for the initiated. Christian style fulfillment patterns, reading earlier scripture through later theological insight, allegorical and speculative exegesis were symbolic meaning expanded beyond the literal sense. A less rigid approach of textual wording, allowing adopt, adaptation in the service of interpretation. In contrast, Rabbinic Judaism in this period increasingly emphasized textual stability and disciplined transmission. After repeated catastrophes, preservation became paramount. The Hebrew scriptures were treated as invulnerable. I can say it. And interpretation operated within carefully guarded boundaries. Fixity was a safeguard against fragmentation, but in Alexandria, fixity was not the only option. There, scripture could be engaged dynamically. Translation was not merely mechanical, it could be interpretive. Harmonization was not necessarily corruption, it could be clarification. Expansion was not automatically distortion, it could be perceived as unveiling deeper truth. If divine revelation was layered, then textual modification might be viewed not as betrayal, but as participation in the unfolding of meaning. The difference is subtle but significant. A preservation community copies what is received. An adaptive community reshapes what is received in response to crisis and insight. Both claim fidelity to scripture, but differ in method in their tolerance for textual fluidity. Egypt provided precisely the intellectual climate in which such fluidity could develop. It allowed Jewish identity to survive outside the land. It encouraged engagement with Greek philosophical categories. It exposed Jewish communities to Christian interpretive frameworks and Gnostic speculative systems. It normalized theological experimentation. In my reconstruction, the group reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls did not arise in isolation in the Judean desert as a strict relic of the Second Temple period. Rather, it developed within this Alexandrian crucible, a community responding to historical defeat not by retreating into stricter preservation, but by entering Scripture more deeply, reshaping it, expanding it, and aligning it with newly absorbed interpretive paradigms. This Egyptian setting helps explain one of the most perplexing characteristics of the Dead Sea Scrolls, their inconsistent handling of the biblical text. The textual forms reflected in the scrolls do not present a single rigidly preserved Hebrew tradition. Instead, they display variation, sometimes subtle, sometimes substantial. In my reconstruction, this variation is not accidental, it is the result of a community operating within bilingual and theologically fluid environment. In Alexandria, other centers of the diaspora, I can't say that, Greek translations of Scripture were not static relics of a distant past. They were being copied, revised, and interpreted in living communities. What later came to be grouped under the label Septuagint was not a single frozen edition, but a collection of Greek textual traditions that had undergone development. Christian interpreters were reading Israel's scriptures through Christological lenses. Gnostic thinkers were layering cosmological symbolism onto inherited texts. Translation functioned not only as a linguistic transfer, but as interpretation. Within such an atmosphere, textual boundaries could soften. If a Hebrew wording appeared obscure, a Greek rendering might clarify it. If a Greek reading offered theological coherence, it could be seen as illuminating the Hebrew. If two passages appeared to conflict, harmonization could resolve tension. The text was not viewed as a closed artifact, it was an unfolding revelation requiring alignment with deeper insight. In this framework, the sect behind the Dead Sea Scrolls appears to have engaged in several practices that diverged sharply from later rabbinic norms. First, Hebrew texts were not insulated from Greek influence. Reading Readings that appear closer to Greek traditions than to what would later become the Masoretic standard suggest per a per let's try this again. uh, we're all the way back. First, Hebrew texts were not isolated from Greek influence. Readings that appear closer to Greek traditions than what would later become the Masoretic standard suggest permittably between, I'm not sure I said that right, between linguistic streams. Rather than guarding a single textual lineage, this group seems to have allowed cross-pollination. cross-pollination. Second, supposed contradictions were often harmonized rather than preserved, where rabbinic tradition would transmit divergent readings faithfully, even if they stood in tension. This community appears more comfortable smoothing seeming inconsistencies. Third, expansions and interpretive additions suggest that Scripture could be elaborated, clarifying phrases, theological amplifications, or adjusted wordings may have been perceived as corruptions, but not. Yeah. Or adjusted. Let's go back a little more. Clarifying phrases, theological amplifications, or adjusted wordings may not have been perceived as corruptions, but as inspired revelations. If revelation was layered, then unpacking it within the text itself was not transgression, it was participation. Finally, translation itself could be treated as revelatory. A Greek rendering was not necessarily secondary to Hebrew, it could be a legitimate expression of divine meaning. If so, then moving between languages was not simply mechanical copying, it was theological engagement. These practices stand in marked contrast to the scribal discipline that later characterized Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic transmission increasingly emphasized precision, stability, and reverent restraint. The task of the scribe was preservation, not innovation. Even anomalies were transmitted carefully rather than corrected. The scrolls in this reconstruction reflect a different posture. They do not appear as the product of a community obsessed with textual fixity. They appear as the work of a group navigating multiple textual traditions in a period of theological uncertainty. Their approach suggests experimentation, an effort to reconcile inherited scripture with new interpretive frameworks absorbed in Egypt. By the close of the second century, the environment that had allowed theological experimentation in Egypt shifted sharply. Under the reign of Septimus Severus in AD 193 to 211, imperial policy tightened and suspicion of minority religious movements intensified. Egypt, and especially Alexandria, had long been volatile, religiously diverse, politically sensitive, and prone to unrest. Under Severus, tolerance narrowed and enforcement strengthened. Historical evidence suggests that restrictions were imposed on religious expansion, particularly involving Judaism and Christianity. Even if enforcement varied by region, the effect would have been destabilizing for smaller, unconventional groups. Large organized communities could endure scrutiny, marginal sects could not. The group described in this reconstruction would have been especially exposed. They were not part of the increasingly structured rabbinic network forming elsewhere in the Jewish world. They were not integrated into the developing Christian ecclesiastical hierarchy. They were a hybrid movement, textually experimental, theologically adaptive, and likely limited in number. In times of repression, such communities do not survive pressure, they collapse under it. Alexandria during this period was capable of direct suppression. Arrests, executions, expulsions, and forced dispersals were not abstract threats. A small sect blending traditions and circulating non standard textual texts would have had no institutional shield. Once targeted, its leaders could have been eliminated quickly. Without leadership, coher- co- cohesion dissolves. Without cohesion, identity disappears. In this model, the end of this In this model, the end of the group was not gradual assimilation, it was destruction. Its leaders were likely arrested or killed, and its members were scattered, absorbed into other communities, or silenced. Its gatherings ceased. Its interpretive project ended abruptly. The movement itself was extinguished. What survived was not the sect, but its manuscripts. If the group maintained a library, collections of biblical manuscripts, harmonized texts, expansions, and interpretive works, those scrolls could have been hidden as danger mounted concealed. Bleh. Let's start over. If the group maintained a library, collections of biblical manuscripts, harmonized texts, expansions, and interpretive works, those scrolls could have been hidden as danger mounted. Concealment would have been an act of desperation, preserving sacred materials even as the community around them disintegrated. When repression came in when repression came in full force, the people were removed from history, the text remained. By the early 3rd century, the sect no longer existed as a living body. It did not evolve into another movement. It did not leave institutional descendants. It was wiped out of the pressures of imperial consolidation. If this sect was destroyed under imperial repression, its manuscripts would not have perished with it. Bleh, I can't read today. I never can read, but we'll continue. If this sect was destroyed under imperial repression, its manuscripts would not have perished with it. Scrolls can survive where communities do not. At some later point, these writings would have come into the hands of more orthodox Jewish authorities, men committed to preserving what they understood to be the authentic Hebrew scriptures. The Masoretic text represented the stable and authoritative form of the Hebrew Bible, the faithful preserved and received text. Rabbinic Judaism increasingly defined itself by disciplined transmission, careful copying, guarded interpretation, and resistance to alteration. The integrity of the Hebrew text was central to Jewish survival after national catastrophe. When Orthodox rabbis encountered the library of this extinguished sect, the contrast would have been stark. They would have recognized deviations from the authentic Hebrew tradition. They would have seen harmonizations where the original text preserved tensions. They would have identified expansions that did not belong to the inherited wording. They would have detected traces of Greek influence embedded within the Hebrew manuscripts, evidence of interpretive mixing foreign to the disciplined scribal culture they upheld. The rabbi the rabbis committed to preserving their original Hebrew text, such features were not harmless variations, they were corruptions. Yet, the situation posed a serious dilemma. Even corrupted scrolls contained the divine name. Let's try that again. Yet, the situation posed a serious dilemma. Even corrupted scrolls contained the divine name. They transmitted passages of Torah and prophets, albeit altered, Jewish reverence for scripture forbade casual destruction. Burning biblical manuscripts, even flawed ones, would have violated deeply held convictions about the sanctity of the written word, but allowing them to circulate was equally unacceptable. If copied, their corruptions could spread. If studied, their speculative theology might introduce confusion. If treated as legitimate textual witnesses, they could undermine the stability the rabbis were laboring to secure. The solution was containment. In later Jewish practice, worn, damaged, or unusable sacred texts were placed in a Genezra, a repository for materials too holy to discard, yet unsuitable for continued use. Eventually, such texts were buried. The, the act was not archival preservation for future study, it was it was re it was I can't read that word. It was removal from circulation, we'll just call it that. In this reconstruction, something similar occurred on this larger scale. A protogeneza, the manuscripts of this I can't read that word either. I can't read. The manuscripts of this sect, we'll call them, were gathered and sealed away deliberately. They were not incorporated into the preserved Hebrew textual stream. They were not recopied. They were not cited as authoritative. Instead, they were removed from active transmission to protect the integrity of the authentic Hebrew tradition that the rabbis were preserving. Their burial may have even been formal and placed with a respected rabbi or placed in a location intended to ensure both the dignity and finality, sacred but unusable, honored but excluded. The purpose was not to safeguard them for posterity, it was to prevent contamination. By bearing these scrolls, the rabbis could uphold two commitments simultaneously: reverence for the sanctity of Scripture and unwavering fidelity to the original Hebrew text. The Masoretic tradition continued forward, copied with precision, guarded with care, while the experimental manuscripts of a failed sect were sealed beneath the earth. They were not destroyed because they contained holy words. They were buried because they did not faithfully preserve them. The official narrative places the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 attributed to Bedouin shepherds near Qumran. In this reconstruction, however, that was not the true beginning of their modern story. Rather, 1947 may have marked a public unveiling of materials that had already been circulating quietly within scholarly or institutional hands. I suspect the scrolls were rediscovered decades earlier, around the turn of the 20th century, during the height of British archaeological activity in the Near East. This was a period when Palestine attracted intense interest from European explorers, biblical scholars, and imperial administrators. Excavations multiplied, collections expanded rapidly, museums in London, Oxford, Berlin, and Jerusalem competed for prestige through acquisition. The most plausible candidate within this environment is Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie. I'm sure I said that right. Flinders, we'll call him Flinders Petrie, was a pioneering archaeologist whose influence extended throughout Egypt and Palestine. He trained a generation of excavators and shaped the emerging discipline of scientific archaeology. His work emphasized typology, stratigraphy, and careful recording. Yet the broader archaeological ecosystem in which he operated was far less regulated than modern practice. This was an era marked by ambiguity. Grave robbing and illegitimate antiquities trading were widespread. Local laborers frequently uncovered artifacts independently and sold them through informal networks. Excavation standards varied dramatically between expeditions. Let's try that again. Excavation standards varied dramatically between expeditions. Documentations could be incomplete, selective, or delayed. Significant findings were sometimes dispersed quietly into private collections, institutional storerooms, or unpublished archives without comprehensive public reporting. The boundaries between legal excavation, private acquisition, and unofficial removal were not always clearly defined. If the if scrolls of immense antiquity had been uncovered under such conditions, particularly within a burial cave or funeral context, their handling would have been delicate. Questions of ownership, export permissions, Ottoman or later British legal restrictions, and excavation authority could have made immediate publication complicated. If the discovery involved disturbance of a tomb or removal without formal authorization, public acknowledgment might have threatened reputation, funding, or institutional credibility. In such a scenario, discretion would have been safer than disclosure. The scrolls would not necessarily be announced, they would be archived, stored quietly, catalogued privately, preserved without fanfare. Early 20th century museum storage rooms were vast and often only partially catalogued. Material could remain boxed, wrapped, or filed under provin, provenal I can't read under provenal descriptions for years, sometimes decades, before full scholarly attention was given. A discovery deemed sensitive, religiously or that a discovery deemed sensitive, rigorously explosive, politically complicated, or legally ambiguous could easily be set aside until circumstances were more favorable. The geopolitical climate enforced this plausibility. The late Ottoman period, the First World War, the collapse of the Ottoman authority, and the establishment of the British Mandate created the overlapping and shifting legal regime. Antiquities antiquities laws were evolving and inconsistently enforced. An artifact discovered in the gray zone of authority might have been easier to conceal temporarily than to explain publicly. In this reconstruction, the scrolls did not burst into history in 1947 as an unexpected desert revelation. Rather, they had already passed through modern hands, handled, evaluated, perhaps even partially studied by archaeologists operating in a permissive and loosely regulated environment. The 1947 narrative, then, would represent not discovery but reintroduction. Not the moment the scrolls were found, but the moment they were presented to the world under the conditions that made their appearance more acceptable and strategically advantageous. Oh man. As the Rockefeller Museum took shape in Jerusalem in the early 20th century, it became a central repository for archaeological materials gathered under British administration. Formally opened in 1938 as the Palestine as Formerly opened in 1938 as the Palestine Archaeological Museum and later known as the Rockefeller Museum, it was it was designed not merely as a display space, but as a consolidating institution, a place where artifacts from across the mandatory Palestine would be stabilized, cataloged, and interpreted under centralized oversight. Collections that had previously been dispersed, privately stored, or insufficiently documented were reorganized and absorbed into a more formal system of care. Crates arrived from earlier expeditions. Field notes recon- were reconciled with objects. Items whose origin or bleh, items whose original excavation contexts were poorly recorded were assigned pro- provisional clarification. In such an atmosphere of consolidation, overlooked materials could suddenly receive renewed attention. It is within this window between the early 1900s and the public announcement of the scrolls in 1947 that I place a quiet but decisive moment recognition. If the if the manuscripts had already been recovered earlier, even unofficially, they may have entered museum storage as ambiguous materials, rolled fragments or parchment, brittle leather sheets, partially legible biblical texts. At first glance, they might not have seemed as extraordinary. Museums frequently handled manuscript fragment bleh. Museums frequently handled manuscript fragments without a dramatic discovery narrative attached. They could have been logged as routine acquisitions awaiting fuller examination. Only later, during systematic reorganization or expert review, would trained epigraphers or paleographers have studied them closely enough to recognize their magnitude. The age suggests by script the unfamiliar sectarian terminology, the mixture of biblical texts and community rules, the possibility that these were not medieval copies but something far older or at least presented as such at that moment. The central issue would not have been discovery, it would have been presentation. If the manuscripts display textual variation, theological experimentation, or signs of fluid biblical tradition, public release would uh, immediately trigger destabilizing questions. Who composed them? Why do certain readings diverge from the stabilized Masoretic tradition? How do they relate to early Christianity, to rabbinic Judaism, to contemporary political tensions in a land where religious identity and territorial authority were tightly interwoven? Uncontrolled disclosure could ignite controversy across multiple fronts: academic, eschatological, and political. Rather than allowing such questions to erupt spontaneously, a framework would need to be constructed in advance. In this reconstruction, several strategic decisions were made during this quiet period of recognition. First, provenance was simplified. If recovery circumstances were ambiguous, grave disturbance, undocumented acquisition, yeah, let's try that again. If recovery circumstances were ambiguous, grave disturbance, undocumented acquisition, or unofficial excavation, the resulting account would not withstand scrutiny. A cleaner origin story would be essential. A dramatic but uncomplicated desert discovery narrative would resolve legal ambiguity while capturing public imagination. Second, a second, authorial specifically I can't read. Man. Second, authorial specificity was removed. If internal clues hinted at second if internal clues hinted at later sectarian development or theological hybridity, that's a weird word, attaching those identities publicly would unsettle established narratives of textual stability. It would be safer to situate the manuscripts within a remote, isolated Jewish group, ancient enough to avoid direct entanglement with Christianity or rabbinic authority. Third, historical context was repositioned rather than linking the text to the intense theological ferment of the second century. After the destruction of Jerusalem or during the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt, they could be dated securely to the pre-70 period by moving them decisively before Christianity's emergence as a defined movement. Their contents could be interpreted as background rather than competition. This reframing clarifies several otherwise puzzling features. The absence of explicit the absence of explicit of ex, oh, let's just reword this. I can't say it. The absence of explicit names, datable historical individuals becomes advantageous rather than problematic. Veiled titles, teacher, wicked priest, interpreter of the law, can remain symbolic rather than traceable. The lack of direct reference to Jesus or identifiable early Christian leaders avoids immediate confrontation with established Christian hagiography. I don't even know what that word is. The text appears messianic, apocalyptic, and sectarian, yet safely pre Christian. Most importantly, the manuscripts are presented as timeless. They exist in suspended ambiguity, ancient, mysterious, and sectarian, yet detached from precise historical disruption. Their producers become an abstract community, reconstructed through scholarly inference rather than a movement intersecting directly with Christianity or Rabbinic Judaism. In the setting, the Essene hypothesis provided an elegant solution. Ancient writers such as Flavius Josephus and Pliny had already described an esoteric Jewish group dwelling in the desert near the Dead Sea. The category existed in classical literature. It required no surviving institution, no doctrinal community, no living heirs. It belonged safely in antiquity. By placing the manuscripts within the established frame, scholars could anchor the scrolls to a recognizable ancient sect without igniting doctrinal upheaval. The Essene explanation did not need to be invented, it merely needed to be applied. Crucially, this interpretive framework was available before 1947. The intellectual groundwork had already been laid. When the scrolls emerged publicly, the interpretive vessel was waiting. Thus, what appears in 1947 as a dramatic desert revelation may instead represent the accumulation of years, perhaps decades, of internal assessment, cautious deliberation, and narrative calibration. The scrolls were not simply found, they were framed, and once framed, subsequent interpretation naturally flowed along the channels defined in that initial moment of silent recognition. Most importantly, they could be used to legitimize Jewish claim to the land. Just as the new nation is taking form, the scrolls function as the perfect propaganda piece at the perfect time. James Leslie Starkey was, this kind of goes off topic a little bit, but I chose to include it because it introduces a broader problem with a lot of dating of ancient manuscripts, more specifically the Lakish letters. So this is why I included this thing with James Starkey. He's not directly involved with the scrolls, but I just felt like I needed to include them. So there's a bit of speculation that I'm promoting here, so it could be very wrong. I just wanted to have a little disclaimer about that. So we'll continue. James Starkey was not a peripheral figure in the archaeological world of Mandatory Palestine. He was a respected field archaeologist, closely connected to British excavation efforts, and deeply involved in the institutional world that surrounded the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem. He had access to sites, to collections, and to storage facilities where materials from earlier excavations were housed. In 1938, Starkey was murdered while traveling to the Rockefellers Let's try this again. In 1938, Starkey was murdered while traveling to the Rockefeller Museum's opening ceremony. Official explanations attributed his death to the political violence of the Arab Revolt, then convulsing the region. That explanation is historically plausible. The late 1930s were marked by instability, ambushes, and reprisals. His death occurred in a genuinely dangerous environment, yet the timing invites scrutiny. He was en route to a ceremony celebrating the formal establishment of a museum that consolidated archaeological holdings in Jerusalem. If, in this reconstruction, the scrolls had already passed quietly through modern hands and were stored within institutional collections, Starkey would have been among the small circle capable of knowing it. He operated in precisely the world where undocumented discoveries could be evaluated, discussed privately, and archived. If he knew that the scrolls were not in a recent desert discovery, but earlier acquisitions, that knowledge would have been sensitive. If he understood that their provenance was unclear, that their dating required adjustment, or that their future public preservation would need careful framing, he would have possessed information with significant implications. The danger would not necessarily lie in malice, but in disclosure. If the manuscripts were to be reintroduced to the world under a controlled narrative, any premature or conflicting account could unravel the presentation. Questions about prior discovery, undocumented transfer, or manipulated chronology would compromise institutional credibility. Silence would be crucial until the framing was secure. Was Starkey's death directly connected to such knowledge? There is no definite there is no definitive evidence establishing that claim. The official explanation situates his murder within the broader political turmoil of the time, yet in a reconstruction that proposes prior discovery and narrative management, the coincidence becomes unsettling. He was not killed years earlier or later. He was killed en route to the opening of the very institution that would house the later present the scrolls. If he posed knowledge that conflicted with a future public narrative, knowledge about provenance, staging, or dating, his voice would have been inconvenient. Whether his death was random violence in a turbulent region or the silencing of someone who knew too much cannot be proven conclusively, but within this model the question cannot be dismissed lightly. If the scroll's modern story required careful construction, then those who knew the unvarnished version would represent risk. And in moments when institutions are consolidating authority and shaping historical memory, risk is not tolerated casually. Starkey's death may have been coincidence, or it may mark the point at which dangerous knowledge disappeared along with the man who carried it. I only raise Starkey's name because of the broader implications that would follow if the Dead Sea Scrolls institutionally were intentionally misdated. If that were true, it would not remain an isolated issue. It would inevitably cast doubt on other discoveries from the same era and region. Finds such as the Lakish letters, which have long been treated as securely dated anchors for the late first temple period. That is where the real weight of the argument lies. Once the possibility of deliberate misdating enters the picture, it does not confine itself neatly to one collection of texts. It opens the door to re-examining related discoveries, associated excavations, and the scholarly framework built upon them. Before long, you find yourself descending Before long, you find yourself descending a rabbit hole that winds. Good grief. Before long, you find yourself descending a rabbit hole that winds rather than narrow. It widens rather than narrows, raising more questions than it answers. If the scrolls had already been recovered earlier and quietly held within institutional control, a final step would have been required to bring them conveniently into public history. That step would not simply involve publication or scholarly announcement, it would require a discovery narrative, geographically anchored, archaeologically plausible, and dramatic enough to withstand scrutiny. Harding was trained within the archaeological tradition shaped by Flinders Peters, inheriting a methodological framework that emphasized typology, stratigraphy, and careful material clarification, or classification, rather. He later became Director of Antiquities for the Department of Antiquities of Jordan, granting him direct administrative authority over excavations east of Jerusalem, including the region surrounding Qumran. He was not merely a field archaeologist, he was a gatekeeper. He approved permits, he supervised excavations, he authenticated he authenticated yeah, that word. He participated he, he authenticated finds. He participated in shaping the public narrative of discovery. In this model, Harding posed both the access and institutional capacity to guide the scroll's public emergence. If manuscripts had been quietly stored for decades, their reintroduction would require a crucible, archaeological context. Yeah, let's try that again. Their reintroduction would require a credible archaeological context, one that would withstand academic inspection while also capturing the imagination of the public. A desert cave near the Dead Sea offered precisely such a setting. The region was remote enough to invoke mystery, yet historically resonant. Classical writers had already described esoteric Jewish groups dwelling near the Dead Sea. The terrain suggested antiquity, the isolation implied preservation, the landscape itself could function as authentication. I can't speak. Within this framework, several possibilities emerge. Harding was Harding may have directly overseen the placement of the scroll materials within accessible caves, ensuring that they could later be discovered under controlled conditions. Alternatively, he may have relied on trusted intermediaries, local laborers, Bedouin contracts, or field associates, maintaining professional distance while ensuring narrative coherence. Or he may simply have shaped and stabilized an already unfolding discovery, guiding its auth- authentication and framing its interpretation from the moment fragments surface. The precise mechanics are less important than the structural outcome, a controlled discovery with institutional oversight. The official account of Bedouin shepherds stumbling upon jars in 1947 offered An ideal narrative opening. It was accidental, romantic, and resistant to forensic verification. Such stories carry emotional authenticity while limiting documentary traceability. Once fragments began circulating on the antiquities market, authorities could step in not as originators but as custodians, formalizing the find through systematic excavation, cave survey, and scholarly publication. From that point forward, the narrative could proceed under professional management. The timing of the scroll's emergence is particularly striking. They enter public awareness on the eve of the establishment of the modern state of Israel, a Jewish nation reconstituted after catastrophe suddenly found itself accompanied by ancient Hebrew manuscripts emerging from its own soil, texts that seem to demonstrate deep antiquity, textual continuity, and rooted presence in the land. The, the, the symbolic reverence was profound. Desert caves yielded scriptures, ancient words surfaced alongside modern sovereignty. In such a moment, the scrolls functioned as more than archaeological artifacts. They became cultural anchors. They reinforced narratives of historical depth. They bridged antiquity and modern identity. They offered tangible material continu- continuity between ancient Judea and the emerging political reality of the 20th century. If this reconstruction is correct, the Qumran caves were not merely archaeological sites, they were the stage upon which the carefully calibrated historical drama was introduced to the modern world. Harding, situated at the intersection of archaeology, administration, and regional authority, would have been uniquely positioned to direct that final act. He he understood both material culture and institutional procedure. He knew how discoveries moved from the desert to museum to press release. The scrolls did not simply appear, they appeared at a moment of maximum interpretive and symbolic power. And in historical theater, timing, especially when paired with authority, is rarely accidental. Once the scrolls were introduced to the public, access to them did not immediately become open, competitive, or broadly collaborative. Instead, let's try that again. Access to them did not immediately become open, competitive, or broadly collaborative. Instead, editorial control rested in the hands of a relatively small and interconnected group of scholars, many working under ecclesiastical or European academical. I can't even read that word. We'll skip it. Central among them was Ronald DeVoe, whose leadership in excavation and interpretation gave early structure to the developing narrative. Photographs were limited, inscriptions circulated selectively, physical fragments were handled within a controlled scholarly circle, often centered at the Rockefeller Museum. Access required permission. Publication schedules were slow. The wider academic communities, particularly scholars outside established European networks, worked largely from summaries, preliminaries, reports, or second-hand descriptions. For decades, the broader scholarly world operated with partial information. Such consideration of such concentration of authority was predictable consequences. When a small circle controls primary materials, interpretive diversity narrows. Competing hypotheses struggle to gain traction without direct access to manuscripts. The earliest explanatory frameworks tend to harden into consensus, not necessarily because it is proven beyond doubt, but because it is the only fully documented account available. Over roughly 40 years, several developments unfolded. First, a single interpretive framework consolidated. The identification of Qumran as an Essene settlement and the scrolls as the library of a pre-Christian Jewish sect gradually shifted from proposal to presumption. What began as a working hypothesis, supported by parallels in classical sources, became embedded in textbooks. lectures, documentaries, and popular imagination. The Essene model ceased to feel tentative, it became the story. It became the story. Second, dating assumptions followed a similar trajectory. Paleographic estimates, archaeological correlations, and historical reconstructions were introduced early and reintegrated yeah, re and reiterated frequently. In the absence of broad independent re-examination, these estimates matured into near certainties. Provisional become yeah, provisional became probable, probable became established. Third, alternative explanations encountered structural disadvantage. Scholars without access to the photographic archive or physical fragments could not mount sustained textual challenges. Questions about provenance, cave context, editorial layering, or chronological placement lacked the evidentiary leverage necessary to compete with institutional authority. Over time, dissent was not merely debated, it was marginalized. To challenge the framework was to position oneself outside the emerging scholarly mainstream. By the time broader access expanded in the late 20th century, particularly after publication controversies and release of photographic archives, arch- the interpretive architecture was already firmly in place. New scholars entered a field whose conceptual boundaries were pre-drawn. Qumran equaled Essene. The scrolls equaled the pre-70 sectarian Judaism. Textual diversity equaled Second Temple plurality. Even newly available data tended to be interpreted within inherited categories. Institutional consensus exerted gravitational force. It does not require conspiracy, inertia is sufficient. Once a narrative is stabilized across universities, museums, and published houses, displacement becomes difficult, not because alternatives are impossible, but because the framework itself structures perception. In this reconstruction, the period of restriction access was not incidental, it was formative. The delay allowed the interpretive story to stabilize before scrutiny intensified. It permitted early assumptions to solidify into academic orthodoxy. It ensured that when wider access finally arrived, it encountered not a field in flux, but a narrative already deeply rooted in scholarly and public consensus, or consciousness, rather. In this reconstruction, the Dead Sea Scrolls are not pristine windows into untouched Second Temple Judaism. They are instead the textual remains of a post Bar Kokhba Jewish movement shaped by trauma, theological experimentation, and sectarian reconfiguration. That movement did not endure. Its manuscripts were contained, absorbed, or suppressed by more dominant authorities. Centuries later, those texts resurfaced not as a legacy of a defeated movement, but as artifacts framed within a carefully constructed antiquity. The scrolls in this model tell a double story. On the surface, they illuminate an ancient world, its sex, its scriptural plurality, its messianic expectations. Beneath that surface lies another narrative: how modern institutions curate discovery, regulate interpretation, and stabilize historical meaning before broader participation becomes possible. Antiquity in this telling is not merely uncovered, it is presented. The authority of the scrolls rests not solely on parchment and ink, but on institutional confidence, on museums, editorial communities, excavation reports, and decades of academic reinforcement. Their credibility is inseparable from the structure that authenticates I do not like that word. Authenticate that authenticates them. Thus, the central mystery shifts. The question is not only who composed the scrolls, it is why the modern world was prepared to receive them precisely as they were introduced. Why this dating? Why this provenance? Why this sectarian framing? Why this moment in the mid 20th century? The deepest puzzle may not belong to the desert at all. It may belong to the modern institutions that needed these texts to be ancient, and to appear ancient is exactly the way they were presented. And that is the end.